What happens when the abandoned house next door decorates itself every Halloween for 9 years, and no one can explain who's doing it. When a cheerful scarecrow in your grandparents' field becomes the last thing a 7-year-old sees before vanishing. When an unknown number joins your friend group chat, knows everything about your lives, and sends photos taken from inside your bedrooms while you sleep. Tonight we bring you 3 accounts of Halloween terrors that prove the most persistent fears aren't the ones that announce themselves with screams and violence. They're the ones that watch from empty windows, hide behind plausible explanations, and know your name before you've ever met. From suburban houses that should be empty but somehow maintain perfect decorations year after year, to rural farms where scarecrows can't protect children from predators who study property lines and wait for the perfect moment, to digital stalkers who infiltrate friend groups and demonstrate surveillance so complete it suggests they've been inside your home. These stories reveal that modern horror wears masks of normalcy. The friendly neighbor who doesn't exist in any public records. The drifter who camps in abandoned cabins planning abductions with methodical patience. The home invader who turns out to be just an opportunistic thief while the real threat remains unidentified and watching. This is what happens when October 31st becomes a lens through which we see the paranoia that should exist year-round. When decorative jack-o'-lanterns remind us that empty houses are windows, scarecrows have hollow eyes, and unknown numbers can learn everything about us while we sleep believing we're safe behind locked doors and privacy settings. My name is Alex, and I live in a quiet suburb of Seattle where houses are expensive, neighbors keep to themselves, and the most exciting thing that usually happens is someone's car getting broken into maybe once a year. The house next door to mine has been abandoned since 2015 when the previous owner, an elderly man named Robert Thompson, according to the faded for sale sign that stood in the overgrown yard for years, apparently moved out or died or simply disappeared without anyone noticing or caring enough to investigate. The house fell into that limbo state where it's not quite condemned but clearly not maintained, paint peeling and gutters sagging and lawn becoming a miniature wilderness that the HOA complained about periodically but never actually did anything to address. But every Halloween, without fail, the house transformed. On October 31st each year, I would wake up to find the abandoned property next door suddenly and mysteriously decorated with perfect Halloween displays, carved jack-o'-lanterns on the porch steps, fake cobwebs stretched across the front windows, orange string lights outlining the roof, even a giant inflatable black cat that would appear on the dead lawn looking absurdly cheerful among the weeds. The first year this happened in 2016, I assumed the property management company, or maybe Robert's distant relatives, were making an effort to maintain some connection to the community, to show the house wasn't completely forgotten. It seemed almost touching in a way, this gesture toward normalcy and neighborhood participation from an otherwise abandoned building. But when Halloween ended on November 1st, the decorations didn't come down. They stayed up for weeks, gradually deflating and fading and blowing around in the wind until they were just sad remnants of a holiday long past. Eventually, usually sometime in January, they would disappear, presumably removed by whoever had put them up in the first place, and the house would return to an abandoned state. This pattern repeated every year for 9 years. Every October 31st, new decorations would appear, always slightly different themes and arrangements, suggesting actual thought and planning rather than just pulling the same boxes from storage. In 2018, there was a skeleton family posed like they were having a picnic on the porch. In 2020, during the pandemic when my neighborhood was particularly quiet and isolated, the abandoned house sprouted a graveyard in the front yard with wooden tombstones and names I didn't recognize carved into them. In 2022, the theme was classic horror movies with cardboard cutouts of famous monsters positioned in the windows. Each year I told myself I would stay up and watch to see who was doing this, to finally solve the mystery that had become my obsession. But here's where it gets strange, and this is the part that transformed my curiosity into genuine unease. Every time I tried to catch whoever was decorating the house, something would prevent me from actually witnessing it. In 2019, I set up a camera pointed at the property, only to find the battery had died despite being fully charged the night before. In 2021, I stayed awake all night watching from my bedroom window, and somehow fell into the deepest sleep of my life around 4 a.m. only to wake at dawn to find the decorations already in place. It was like the house itself didn't want to be observed, like whatever was happening there required absence of witnesses to complete its transformation. The decorations should have felt festive and harmless, but instead they created a growing sense of wrongness that I couldn't shake. Who decorates an abandoned house year after year? Why only Halloween? Why did the decorations seem to know things? Like in 2023 when a tombstone appeared with a date that matched my father's death anniversary from earlier that year, information that shouldn't have been publicly available and that I'd never shared with neighbors. I would stand in my yard staring at the abandoned house next door with its cheerful Halloween displays and feel like something behind those darkened windows was looking back at me and had been looking at me for 9 years while I tried and failed to understand what was happening just 20 feet from where I slept every night. On October 15th, 2024, I saw something that transformed my Halloween curiosity into genuine fear. It was late afternoon, that golden hour when sunlight comes in at angles that create dramatic shadows, and I was taking out my trash when movement in the abandoned house's second-floor window caught my eye. A silhouette, definitely human-shaped, tall and thin and completely motionless, stood framed in the window looking down at me, not looking out at the street or yard in some vague way, but directly at me, tracking my movement across my driveway with the stillness of something that had been standing there a long time and would continue standing there long after I went back inside. I fumbled for my phone, hand shaking as I opened the camera app and tried to frame a photo that would capture proof of what I was seeing. But the moment I raised the phone, the figure stepped back from the window and disappeared into the darkness of the house's interior. I took the photo anyway, but it showed nothing but an empty window and the reflection of clouds on the dainty glass. I stood there for several minutes more, watching that window, willing the figure to reappear so I could have evidence, but nothing moved in the abandoned house. Just silence and stillness and the growing certainty that I'd finally seen who or what had been decorating the property all these years. What I couldn't know in that moment was that the figure in the window was about to introduce himself, and the explanation he would offer would somehow be worse than having no explanation at all. Because at least mystery allows for the possibility of benign answers, while the truth sometimes reveals dangers you were safe in not knowing about. 3 days later, on October 18th, I was in my backyard raking leaves when I heard a voice call out a friendly greeting. "Beautiful afternoon, isn't it?" I turned to see a man standing at the low fence that separated my yard from the abandoned property next door. He was maybe in his early 50s, average height and build, wearing a plaid flannel shirt and jeans that made him look like someone's uncle or weekend handyman. His smile was wide and warm, the kind of smile that immediately makes people relax and trust, and he had his hand raised in a casual way like we were old friends rather than strangers meeting for the first time. "I'm Mike," he introduced himself, that friendly smile never wavering. "Mike Thompson. I'm Robert's son. You know, the guy who used to live here." He gestured toward the abandoned house behind him like it was the most natural thing in the world for the son of a man who'd left nearly a decade ago to suddenly appear in the overgrown backyard. I'd been meaning to stop by and introduce myself for years, but you know how life gets busy. His tone was conversational and easy, but something about it felt rehearsed, like he practiced his introduction multiple times to get the casual inflection exactly right. And here's the hook that should have made me walk away immediately, but instead pulled me deeper into conversation. Mike asked questions about me that he shouldn't have known to ask. "How's your mother doing after the move last year? Must have been hard adjusting to the new place." But I'd never mentioned my mother to any neighbors, had never discussed a move to assisted living with anyone on this street. Yet Mike spoke like he knew, like he'd been watching and cataloging details of my life without ever announcing his presence. I responded with vague politeness, feeling increasingly uncomfortable but not wanting to be rude to someone who might genuinely be Robert's son checking on his father's property. Mike explained that Robert had disappeared in 2014, went out to a pumpkin patch one October and never came home, if you can believe it, and that Mike had been handling the property from a distance ever since, unable to sell it due to legal complications about declaring someone dead when there's no body. The story was plausible enough, delivered with appropriate sadness and frustration, but his eyes never matched his emotional tone. They stayed flat and calculating, watching my reactions like he was testing which details I'd accept and which might trigger suspicion. Then Mike shifted his weight and his tone changed, became somehow heavier despite his continued smile. "I've been thinking about finally clearing out the place, getting it ready to sell. But I wanted to check with the neighbors first, make sure nobody has concerns about construction noise or anything like that. You know how these old properties can hide problems, rotting floorboards, things living in the walls, spaces between the studs where somebody could hide things for years without anyone knowing." The way he emphasized certain words made them feel less like casual conversation and more like threats disguised as friendly small talk. I told him it sounded fine, that he should do whatever he needed to with his father's property, and excuse myself back into my house with my skin crawling, and the certainty that something about Mike Thompson was very, very wrong. On November 10th, 12 days after my backyard conversation with Mike, I came home from work to find my house had been broken into. The violation was immediately apparent the moment I opened my front door. Drawers pulled open and contents dumped, cushions removed from furniture, closet doors standing ajar with clothes pulled from hangers. Someone had systematically searched my entire house, going through every room with methodical thoroughness. But here's what made my blood run cold and transformed this from a standard burglary into something far more sinister. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere. No broken windows, no damaged locks, no pry marks on door frames. Whoever had been inside had either picked my lock with professional skill or had a key to my house. Nothing was stolen. That was almost worse than if they'd taken my television and laptop and jewelry, because theft would have provided a rational motive I could understand. Instead, everything valuable remained exactly where I'd left it, undisturbed while personal items had been moved and examined. My photo albums were spread across the living room floor. My mail had been opened and read. My laptop showed recent activity in my browsing history. Someone had been checking my email, social media accounts, bank statements, everywhere I existed digitally. They hadn't stolen my identity. They'd studied it, learned everything about me while I was away at work, trusting that locked doors meant safety. And this is where the story takes its darkest turn, the moment that transformed my fear from specific and manageable into shapeless and pervasive. Because when I reported the break-in to police and mentioned Mike Thompson as a possible suspect, Officer Williams looked up from her notes with an expression of confusion. "Who?" she asked. "Mike Thompson, the son of Robert Thompson who used to live next door," I explained. Officer Williams pulled up property records on a tablet, and after a moment of scrolling looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Mr. Thompson," she said slowly, "Robert Thompson died in 2010, and according to all available records, he never had any children." I sat in stunned silence as Officer Williams showed me the documentation. Death certificate dated March 2010, 5 years before I'd even moved to this neighborhood and 6 years before the Halloween decorations started appearing. No surviving family members listed. No Mike Thompson in any county records. No property transfers. No legal complications about missing persons because there was no missing person. Just a dead man whose house had somehow continued decorating itself every Halloween for 9 years while I assumed there was a rational explanation involving distant relatives and property management companies. Officer Williams suggested that perhaps I'd misremembered the name or gotten confused about which neighbor had spoken to me, but I knew with absolute certainty that the man in the backyard had specifically identified himself as Mike Thompson, Robert's son, and had told me a detailed story about his father's disappearance from a pumpkin patch in 2014. I drove to the county clerk's office the next day and personally verified everything Williams had told me. Then I went to the cemetery where Robert Thompson was buried and stood in front of his headstone with its 2010 date, confirmation that the man whose house I'd lived next to for 9 years had been dead the entire time, his property somehow maintaining Halloween traditions he couldn't possibly be orchestrating from beyond the grave. The question that haunts me now, the one that makes me check my locks 3 times before bed and has me installing security cameras at every entrance to my house. If Mike Thompson doesn't exist and Robert Thompson has been dead for over a decade, then who was standing in my backyard making veiled threats about things living in walls and spaces where somebody could hide things for years? Who had been inside my house going through my personal belongings with a key I never gave them? And most terrifying of all, who has been decorating the abandoned house next door every Halloween, creating displays that sometimes reference private details of my life they shouldn't know? I still live in the same house, though I've upgraded every lock and installed a security system that would make a bank jealous. The abandoned property next door remains empty according to all official records, though sometimes at night I hear sounds. Footsteps on the porch, the creak of a door opening, voices murmuring in conversation too low to make out words. On Halloween 2024, decorations appeared again right on schedule despite my cameras pointed directly at the property. When I reviewed the footage, all I found was 8 hours of static, every camera simultaneously malfunctioning during the exact window when the decorations must have been installed. The house stares at me through its empty windows, and I stare back, and we both know that whatever game we've been playing for 9 years isn't over. It's just entered a new phase, one where masks have been removed and pretense of normalcy has crumbled, leaving only the raw fact that something impossible has been happening 20 feet from my bedroom, and no amount of research or police reports or security systems will explain it or make it stop. I'm a father now, telling this story about my son Ethan, who was 7 years old when we spent what should have been a perfect October at my parents' farm in rural Pennsylvania. My wife and I had been planning this visit for months, a full 4 weeks away from our cramped city apartment, giving Ethan a chance to experience real autumn with harvest activities and open spaces, and the kind of wholesome rural childhood I'd had growing up. My parents were getting older, and I wanted Ethan to have memories of helping his grandfather with chores, of learning how things grow and where food comes from before my father became too frail to maintain the property he'd worked for 40 years. Those first weeks were exactly what we'd hoped for. Ethan helped my father collect eggs from the chickens each morning, his small hands careful with the warm shells. We picked apples from the orchard, and my mother taught Ethan how to make pie crust from scratch, his flower-covered face beaming with pride. My father had pulled out all his old Halloween decorations from my own childhood, faded orange lights, plastic pumpkins with battery-operated candles, a collection of ceramic ghosts and witches that my grandmother had painted decades ago. Ethan loved arranging them on the porch, creating displays, and then rearranging them with the serious concentration children bring to tasks adults would consider trivial. But even in those perfect early weeks, small signs appeared that we dismiss as coincidences or natural occurrences, the kind of things that only take on sinister meaning after tragedy strikes, and you look back trying to find the warnings you should have heeded. Pumpkin vines in the garden were crushed like someone had walked through them. Trails appeared in the dew-covered grass leading from the tree line to the edge of the property. The old scarecrow my father had positioned in the field kept changing positions, its wooden post somehow moving several feet overnight, though none of us admitted to touching it. My father seemed more tired than usual that October, spending more time sitting on the porch and less time doing the physical labor that had always defined his relationship with the land. He mentioned feeling watched sometimes, turning quickly to check behind him when working alone in the barn or fields. My mother dismissed it as age and the isolation of rural life, said he'd been spending too much time alone since retiring and his mind was playing tricks. We all wanted to believe that because the alternative, that something was actually wrong, that danger was present on this property where generations of our family had lived safely, was too unsettling to seriously consider. Ethan had become particularly attached to the scarecrow, a traditional figure stuffed with straw and dressed in my father's old work clothes with a burlap sack for a head and button eyes sewn on by my grandmother years before I was born. He'd named it Mr. Buttons and insisted on straightening its hat each morning during our walk around the property, talking to it like it was a guardian watching over the farm. Mr. Buttons keeps the bad things away. He'd told me with the absolute certainty children have about how the world works. I'd smiled and agreed, finding his attachment to the scarecrow charming rather than worrying about what bad things a 7-year-old might think needed keeping away. On October 20th, the day before everything fell apart, Ethan came running inside from his morning visit to Mr. Buttons with news that should have been our final warning. Somebody moved him again, he announced breathlessly. And Papa, there were footprints in the mud around him. Big footprints, not like Grandpa's boots. And Mr. Buttons' hat was on backwards. My father went out to investigate and found exactly what Ethan had described. Boot prints with a tread pattern none of us recognized, pressed deep into the soft earth around the scarecrow, circles suggesting someone had stood there for a long time just watching the house. We should have called the police right then. We should have packed up and left immediately. But rural properties get hunters and hikers passing through, and we told ourselves that's all it was, some stranger cutting through our land without permission, nothing worth disrupting Ethan's perfect autumn over. October 21st started like every morning that month, with Ethan bouncing out of bed at dawn eager to start his routine of feeding chickens and visiting Mr. Buttons before breakfast. I was still half asleep when I heard the front door open at 6:43 a.m. I know the exact time because my phone was on the nightstand showing the minutes, and I'd been dozing with one eye open waiting for my alarm. I heard Ethan's small footsteps cross the porch, heard him call out his usual greeting. "Good morning, Mr. Buttons. Did you keep the bad things away last night?" His voice was cheerful and clear, carrying to the quiet morning air in the way sound travels differently in rural silence and city noise. Then came a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Ethan's scream, sharp and sudden and cut off mid-breath like someone had clamped a hand over his mouth. I was out of bed and running before my conscious mind processed what I'd heard. My wife right behind me, both of us sprinting to the house and out the front door in our pajamas. The field where Mr. Button stood was maybe 100 yards from the house, close enough that we should have been able to see what happened, close enough that my son should have been visible in the morning light. But when we reached the spot where the scarecrow stood with its button eyes and backwards hat, Ethan was gone. What we found instead made my legs nearly give out beneath me. A single blue sneaker lying on its side near the low fence that marked our property line. The laces still tied like it had been pulled off Ethan's foot rather than removed normally. And around the scarecrow, clear as day in the soft earth, were those same unfamiliar boot prints from the day before. Multiple sets now, suggesting more than one person, and drag marks leading toward the fence where our property ended and the woods began. Someone had been waiting in our field, had taken my son with planning and purpose while we slept 20 feet away, thinking locked doors and rural isolation meant safety. My father called 911 while my wife and I ran toward the fence line following those terrible drag marks, calling Ethan's name over and over though we received no response. The state police arrived within 20 minutes, fast for rural Pennsylvania, where distances between locations mean emergency response times that would horrify city dwellers accustomed to officers arriving in minutes. More units came, then K-9 teams from the county, then eventually FBI once it became clear this was an abduction rather than a lost child or family custody dispute. Our perfect October morning had transformed into a command center with vehicles parked across the field and uniformed people examining evidence and asking questions I could barely process through my panic. A neighbor from 2 miles away, an elderly woman named Mrs. Holstetter who lived alone on the property bordering ours, reported seeing a man the previous night around 10 p.m. moving quickly across the back roads that connected our properties. Walking fast, carrying something heavy, she told investigators. I thought it was strange because nobody walks these roads at night, but I figured it was just someone from town taking a shortcut. Didn't get a good look at his face, but he was tall and thin, wearing dark clothes. Moved like someone who knew exactly where he was going. The K-9 unit found Ethan scent trail leading from our field, under the fence, through the woods for maybe half a mile to an old logging road where tire tracks suggested a vehicle had been parked. They say the first 48 hours are critical in abduction cases, and every minute that passed felt like a century while we waited for information that might lead to Ethan's recovery. My wife couldn't speak, just sat on the porch where Ethan had called out to Mr. Buttons that morning, staring at the field like she could will our son back into existence through sheer force of maternal will. My father looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 hours, standing beside the scarecrow he positioned there thinking it was decoration and protection rather than a landmark for predators planning to snatch his grandson. The FBI agent in charge, a woman named Patterson who'd worked child abduction cases for 15 years, found me in the barn where I'd gone to escape the chaos of the investigation for just a moment. "We're going to find him," she said with a certainty I desperately wanted to believe. The K-9 trail is fresh and clear. The logging road connects to only a limited number of properties. We're checking every abandoned structure, every cabin, every place someone might hide a child within 20 miles of here. The K-9s are good at their job, and this perpetrator left us a clear track to follow. Her words were meant to comfort, but instead filled me with terror about what condition Ethan might be in when they found him. What horrors my 7-year-old son might be experiencing while I stood uselessly in my father's barn, being reassured by a stranger with kind eyes and a voice that suggested she'd had the same conversation with too many terrified parents. 4 hours after Ethan's abduction, though it felt like days had passed, the K-9 unit made a breakthrough. The German shepherd named Zeus had been following Ethan scent through increasingly dense woods along a trail that showed recent use, broken branches, and disturbed leaves indicating multiple trips by someone who knew these woods well enough to navigate them in darkness. The trail led to an area my father didn't even know existed on the edge of his property, a section where old-growth trees had never been cleared and the terrain became rocky and difficult to traverse without knowing the exact path through. There, hidden behind a natural outcropping of boulders and surrounded by thick underbrush, stood an abandoned hunting cabin that hadn't appeared on any property maps or surveys. The structure was old, maybe 40 or 50 years, built from rough-hewn logs that had weathered to gray. No windows, just a single door hanging crooked on rusted hinges, and a metal roof partially caved in on one side. The kind of place hikers might stumble across and assume had been forgotten decades ago, not realizing it was being actively used by someone who valued its isolation and the fact that no official records acknowledged its existence. The tactical team surrounded the cabin with a kind of precision that comes from training and experience, their weapons drawn and their movements coordinated through hand signals and whispered radio communications. Agent Patterson positioned herself behind a tree with a clear view of the door while other officers took flanking positions on either side of the structure. The moment stretched towards his wire, everyone knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether this case ended with a rescued child or a tragedy that would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their careers. FBI, we have the cabin surrounded. Patterson's voice carried authority that cut through the forest silence. Send the child out immediately and come out with your hands visible. This is your only warning. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the crooked door creaked open slowly and Ethan stumbled out into afternoon sunlight, blinking like he'd been in darkness for hours. He was alive. He was walking. He appeared physically unharmed, though his face showed the blank shock of trauma that would take years to properly process. An officer ran forward and scooped him up, carrying him away from the cabin toward where my wife and I waited beyond perimeter, prevented from charging in ourselves by officers who had physically held us back. The man who emerged after Ethan was nothing like what I'd imagined during those 4 hours of terror. I'd been picturing a monster, something inhuman and obviously dangerous, someone who looked like the predator he was. Instead, I saw an ordinary-looking man in his 30s or early 40s, average height and build, wearing a simple jacket and pants that could have been anyone's weekend hiking clothes. His face was unremarkable, the kind of face you'd pass in a grocery store without a second glance. Thin beard, brown hair, nothing distinctive or memorable except for his eyes, which carried a flatness that suggested whatever moral compass normal people possess had stopped working in him long ago. He surrendered without resistance, dropping to his knees with hand behind his head in the practiced manner of someone who'd been through this process before, who knew the choreography of arrest and accepted it with resignation rather than fight. Officers moved in quickly, cuffing him and searching his person while others entered the cabin to document what they found inside. Later I would learn those details. The sleeping bag rolled in the corner, the camping stove and canned food suggesting he'd been using this location for weeks or months, the detailed map with our farm circled and notes about routines and schedules, the muddy boots with treads matching the print around our scarecrow. Ethan was taken to the hospital despite appearing physically unharmed, protocol demanding full medical examination in abduction cases. My wife rode in the ambulance with him while I stayed behind to give my statement to investigators, my hands shaking so badly I could barely sign the paperwork. The man, whose name I later learned was David Garrett, a drifter with minor priors for trespassing and theft but nothing in his record suggesting capacity for child abduction, was processed and charged with kidnapping, unlawful restraint, and a list of other charges that would keep him in prison for decades if convicted. The sheriff identified David Garrett as a seasonal worker who drifted between rural areas taking temporary jobs on farms and construction sites, someone who existed on the margins of society with no permanent address or deep connections to any community. He'd been camping in that abandoned cabin on and off for months according to evidence found inside, using it as a base while he worked at jobs in the area and apparently studied families with young children, looking for opportunities that combined isolation with predictable routines. The fact that we'd been visiting for a full month, establishing patterns he could observe and plan around, had made us perfect targets in his calculation. Investigators never found a clear motive beyond opportunity. Garrett claimed during interrogation that he'd intended to ask for ransom but hadn't gotten that far, that Ethan had been taken on impulse when the opportunity presented itself that morning, that he'd been planning to release him unharmed after scaring the family enough to understand rural properties weren't as safe as they assumed. The explanation felt inadequate and probably partially fabricated, a story designed to minimize his culpability rather than reveal true intentions we might never fully understand. What mattered was that Ethan was safe and Garrett was in custody, and the nightmare had ended before the worst possible outcomes materialized. But here's what nobody tells you about surviving something like this. The fear doesn't end when the threat is removed. In fact, in some ways it gets worse because you now have concrete proof that your worst nightmares can manifest in reality, that evil exists and wears ordinary faces and studies your family with methodical patience, waiting for the exact moment when you're most vulnerable. The security you felt before is permanently shattered, replaced by hypervigilance that never fully subsides no matter how much time passes, or how many locks you install, or how many times you tell yourself you're safe now. My father had all the old Halloween decorations, the ones Ethan had arranged so carefully on the porch during those first perfect weeks of October, removed and thrown away. He couldn't look at them without seeing his grandson's face calling out to a scarecrow that had become a landmark for Predator. The scarecrow itself was taken down and burned, my father standing over the flames with tears running down his face, mourning not just the loss of innocence but the transformation of his beloved property from sanctuary into crime scene, from place of happy childhood memories into location forever associated with the 4 hours his grandson was missing. We cut our visit short and returned to the city, unable to stay in a place where every field and tree line might hide someone watching. Ethan underwent therapy, long sessions with a child psychologist who specialized in trauma, and made remarkable progress considering what he'd experienced. But he stopped sleeping with his window open even in summer heat, and he startled violently at unexpected noises, and sometimes I'd find him standing at windows staring out like he was checking for threats in the ordinary landscape of our urban neighborhood. The 7-year-old who believed scarecrows kept bad things away had learned that the bad things were real, and the guardians were hollow. My father developed 2 habits that persisted until his death 5 years later, behaviors that revealed how deeply the incident had marked him even though he'd been the one least directly traumatized by it. First, he walked his entire property line every single morning, checking fences and trails and anywhere someone might access his land from adjoining woods. He documented every footprint and broken branch, maintaining notebooks full of observations that suggested his own form of hypervigilance had replaced a relaxed relationship with his land he'd enjoyed for 40 years. And second, he never again put up any kind of decorative figure in his fields or garden. No scarecrows, no wind spinners, no painted plywood cutouts of animals or seasonal displays. He said he preferred real eyes watching his property, meaning his own eyes, not trusting guardians fashioned from straw and old clothes to protect what mattered when he'd learned too late that such figures could become markers of predators rather than deterrents. My name is Liam, and I was 19 when I created what should have been a harmless group chat for my 3 closest friends to coordinate our Halloween plans. The chat was called Halloween Habit and included my girlfriend Chloe, my best friend since middle school Ben, and our mutual friend Sam who joined our group during our senior year of high school. We'd all stayed in town after graduation, attending the local community college while saving money and figuring out our next moves, and Halloween had always been our favorite holiday to celebrate together with parties and horror movie marathons and elaborate costume coordination. The chat started normally enough in early October, discussing costume ideas, planning which parties would attend, sharing memes about Halloween and spooky season nonsense. Standard friend group banter with inside jokes and playful arguing about whether we should do a group costume or individual outfits. Then on October 10th, a number I didn't recognize appeared in the chat. Not someone I'd added, not showing up as a contact requesting to join, just suddenly present in the participant list like they'd been there all along. The number showed up as +1 555 0847, and their first message was simple and unsettling. Hey Halloween Havoc crew. Excited for the party. We should have left the chat immediately and created a new one. That's what any reasonable person would do when an unknown number somehow infiltrates a private conversation. But we were 19 and thought we were being pranked by another friend. So instead of treating it seriously, we played along, asking who it was and how they'd gotten into our chat. The response came 30 seconds later. Does it matter who I am? I know who all of you are. Liam, Chloe, Ben, Sam. The squad, the Halloween Havoc crew having their annual celebration. 4th year running, right? That detail made my skin crawl. This was indeed our 4th year celebrating Halloween together as a specific friend group, but that wasn't information anyone outside our circle would know or care about. Chloe suggested it was probably Ben playing a prank with a burner phone, but Ben insisted it wasn't him and his annoyance seemed genuine. Sam thought maybe it was someone from one of the parties we were planning to attend. Someone who'd overheard our plans and was trying to insert themselves into our group through digital intrusion. We went back and forth with theories while the unknown number watched silently, not contributing further to the conversation, but maintaining their presence in the chat like a shadow nobody could quite explain or dismiss. Over the next week, the unknown number sent occasional messages that revealed increasingly disturbing levels of knowledge about our lives and routines. They knew Ben worked at the coffee shop on Main Street and got off his shift at 4 p.m. most days. They knew Chloe was taking a psychology class on Tuesdays and Thursdays and always sat in the 3rd row. They knew Sam had an appointment with his therapist every Wednesday at 2 p.m., information Sam had never shared with any of us, let alone strangers. And they knew things about me, my class schedule, where I parked my car, the route I took walking home from campus. Details that suggested either incredibly thorough social media stalking or actual physical surveillance of our movements. Then came the photo that transformed our unease into genuine terror. On October 17th at 11:47 p.m., the unknown number sent an image to the chat without comment or explanation. The photo showed the four of us sitting on a bench in the park near campus, taken from an angle that suggested the photographer had been maybe 20 feet away, partially hidden by trees. We were laughing at something, captured mid-conversation in a candid moment none of us remembered because it had happened 3 days earlier during a normal afternoon hanging out between classes. Someone had been close enough to photograph us without us noticing, close enough to hear our conversation, close enough to be a physical threat if they'd chosen violence instead of documentation. We tried everything to identify or block the unknown number. Ben, who was decent with technology, attempted to trace the phone using various online tools and apps, but every search came back with nothing. The number appeared to be from a device reported stolen years ago, probably reproposed with a new SIM card specifically for this kind of untraceable harassment. We reported it to campus security, who took our statement, but admitted there wasn't much they could do unless actual threats were made or the stalking escalated to physical contact. We considered abandoning our phones entirely and getting new numbers, but the stalker had already demonstrated they could find us in physical space, so changing digital contact information seemed pointless. Despite everything, we decided to go ahead with our Halloween party. Part of it was stubborn refusal to let some anonymous stalker control our lives and ruin traditions we'd maintained for years. Part of it was a desperate hope that maybe throwing the party as planned would draw the stalker out into the open where we could finally identify them and end this nightmare. We created a carefully controlled guest list. Only people we knew personally and trusted, no plus ones or friends of friends who might be the mysterious number giving human form an invitation to enter our space. The party was at my apartment, a small two-bedroom I shared with a roommate who'd agreed to stay at his girlfriend's place for the night to give us space. Chloe, Ben, and Sam arrived early to help set up decorations and food. We'd decided on a classic horror movie theme with posters from films like Halloween and Friday the 13th, orange and purple lighting, a playlist of spooky soundtracks and Halloween classics. By 9 p.m. we had maybe 15 people total, all friends from high school or college classes, everyone in costume and the atmosphere feeling almost normal despite our underlying anxiety about the unknown number who'd been haunting our chat for weeks. Around 1 a.m., when most guests had already left and only a core group of 7 remained, including the 4 of us, there was a knock at my apartment door. I assumed it was a neighbor complaining about noise, though we'd been keeping the volume reasonable out of consideration for the late hour. I opened the door without checking the peephole, a mistake that could have cost much more than it did, and found myself face to face with a man wearing a white silicone mask, the kind that covers your entire face with generic features that make the wearer look simultaneously human and profoundly wrong. Before I could react or close the door, the masked man pushed past me into the apartment with the confidence of someone who'd planned this entry and knew exactly what they intended to do. He pulled a large kitchen knife from inside his jacket, not waving it around dramatically, but holding it steady and low in a way that suggested he knew how to use it. "Everyone sit down and stay quiet," he said, his voice muffled by the mask but calm and controlled. "This is very simple. I'm going to take your phones, wallets, and anything else valuable you've got. Nobody tries to be a hero, nobody gets hurt, and I'm gone in 5 minutes. Understand?" Chloe started crying quietly, the sound muffled by her hand pressed over her mouth. Ben moved closer to her in a protective gesture that would have been touching if we hadn't all been terrified. The other guests, people I knew from classes, friends I'd had over dozens of times, sat frozen on my couches looking at the knife and the mask and probably wondering if they were going to die at a Halloween party in a crappy apartment in their hometown. I felt simultaneously responsible for their safety and completely powerless to do anything except comply with the armed intruder's demands and hope he was telling the truth about leaving after getting what he wanted. What happened next unfolded so quickly that I didn't process it until after everything was over and we were giving statements to police. Sam, who'd been sitting on the arm of the couch closest to the masked man, suddenly moved with precision that suggested training or practice I didn't know he had. He grabbed the man's wrist, the one holding the knife, and twisted it in a specific way that made the intruder cry out and drop the weapon. Before the man could recover, Sam had him face down on my floor with a knee in his back and one arm wrapped behind him at an angle that looked painful. Ben jumped in to help, using his weight to keep the struggling intruder pinned while Sam maintained control of his arms in what I later learned was a proper restraint technique taught in self-defense classes. "Someone call the police," Sam said calmly, his voice betraying none of the adrenaline he must have been feeling. "And somebody grab that knife before he does." I scrambled for my phone with shaking hands and dialed 911 while Chloe picked up the knife and held it away from everyone like it might detonate. The police arrived within 7 minutes, impressively fast for our area, and took over restraining the intruder while we all gave preliminary statements about what had happened. When they pulled off the white silicone mask, the face beneath was unremarkable, a guy maybe in his late 20s or early 30s, someone I'd never seen before in my life, just another stranger in a town small enough that I should have recognized everyone our age. The man arrested at my party was identified as Derek Walsh, a small-time criminal with priors for burglary and theft who lived 2 neighborhoods over from my apartment. He had a simple story. He'd been casing apartments in my complex looking for parties where college students would have phones and laptops and cash, so I was gathering through the window and decided to try an armed robbery thinking costumes and alcohol would make us easy targets. He'd bought the mask at a Halloween store that afternoon and the knife at a kitchen supply store. No sophisticated planning involved beyond basic opportunistic crime. But here's where the story refuses to resolve itself cleanly, where the neat ending of home invader caught and arrested fails to provide actual closure or safety. When police searched Derek Walsh, they found exactly one phone on him, a regular smartphone with normal contacts and messages, nothing suggesting he'd been stalking us for weeks or had any connection to our Halloween Havoc chat. The unknown number that had been terrorizing us, sending photos and demonstrating surveillance-level knowledge of our routines, belonged to someone else entirely. Derek Walsh was just a thief who picked the wrong party to rob on the wrong night. The real stalker remained unidentified, still out there, still watching. The Halloween Havoc chat remains on all our phones like a digital graveyard. The unknown number still listed as a participant, though they haven't sent a message since the night of the party. We've left the chat active. None of us can bring ourselves to delete it, though we've stopped using it for actual conversation. It exists now as a monument to an unsolved mystery, a reminder that we were watched and studied and toyed with by someone who had the resources and patience to conduct surveillance when never detected. Sometimes late at night I'll open the chat and scroll through those old messages, reading the stalker's comment about our schedules and habits, looking for clues we missed that might finally reveal their identity. Chloe developed anxiety severe enough to require medication. Her previous confidence replaced by constant vigilance and the inability to relax in public spaces where she feels observed. Ben moved back in with his parents, unable to shake the feeling that staying in our college town meant remaining vulnerable to whoever had been watching us. Sam revealed after the party that he'd taken self-defense classes specifically because the stalking had made him feel powerless, that the calm precision with which he disarmed Derek Walsh came from weeks of training driven by fear of the unknown number becoming a physical threat. And I installed security cameras at every entrance to my apartment, changed all my social media to private, and developed habits of checking over my shoulder and varying my routes that I suspect will persist for years if not permanently. The question that haunts all of us, the one we discuss in hushed tones when we occasionally get together now, is worse than the attack itself. At least Derek Walsh was resolved, arrested, charged, sentenced to 5 years for armed robbery. But who was the unknown number? How did they access our private chat? How did they know our schedules and habits with such precision? How did they take that photo in the park without us noticing? And most terrifying of all, are they still watching? We've theorized endlessly. Maybe it was someone from campus who had access to student schedules and used that to build a knowledge of our routines. Maybe it was a sophisticated hacker who broke into our phones and read our messages and tracked our locations through the GPS we all carry everywhere. Maybe it was someone we knew personally, a friend or acquaintance whose digital presence we'd never questioned, who smiled at us in person while simultaneously stalking us online. Or maybe it was a complete stranger, someone whose motives we'll never understand and whose identity we'll never learn, who chose us randomly or for reasons that made sense only to their disturbed psychology. The Halloween Havoc chat taught us that modern horror wears digital masks more effective than any silicone covering. That being watched doesn't require someone physically present when phones and social media and public record provide windows into our lives we barely think to cover. That the scariest stalker isn't the one who breaks into your house with a knife, but the one who knows your schedule well enough to photograph you in a park without you even noticing their presence. Derek Walsh's white mask was obvious and frightening, but at least we could see it could identify the threat and respond to it. The unknown number never needed a mask because they never showed their face at all, remaining invisible while demonstrating power more disturbing than any physical violence. The power to watch and know and remain perfectly hidden while we went about our lives thinking privacy and security were things we actually possessed.